Hello, Yu-Gi-Oh players, and welcome to Yu-Gi-Oh! Business Casual. I am your host, the RJB0. Today, I want to talk to you guys about burn. Fair warning, first of all, I am going to do a fair amount of MCOL 40ing, and the reason is because I am fairly sick, so my voice is pretty much shot. That being said, I want to talk to you guys about burn today because, in my opinion, effect damage is the least developed mechanic in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And the reason why I say that is because, well, actually, why don't I allow you to do some thinking back of your own? To give you a sense of perspective as to why I say that and why I want to make this video, think back to any one of the burn decks that you've had the misfortune of facing on Dueling Network or, heaven forbid, in real life. And chances are, in fact, in my estimates, roughly 100% of the time this is true, that deck went one of two ways. Either door one, it sucked biblical amounts of ass. I mean, before its turn was up, it had used every card in its hand and it hadn't even gotten close to its win condition, usually played by a new player who doesn't understand the concepts of pluses and minuses. Or it's better than that, and you go the even worse direction where you happen to be playing against a deck like Frog FTK or Chainburn or anything involving Dark Strike Fighter. And the problem with that is because these decks are degenerate to the highest degree. The point of the deck is to keep the game of keep the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! From being played while you slip your win condition underneath the door. And that's no fun, because if you go to a tournament with that, you may be competitive, you may top, but you're basically going to be spending the day doing the Yu-Gi-Oh! Equivalent of pleasuring yourself. I mean, it blows my mind that Konami has yet to be able to develop a deck that doesn't fit into these two categories. They've had more than a decade to do it. I mean, come on, guys, it's the year 2014. I don't have my jetpack, my hover car, or a non-degenerate burn deck. My generation has failed me clearly. And unlike the first two items in that list, the burn deck isn't rocket science. I mean, in my opinion, it really only takes two requirements in order to make this deck both competitive and more fun to play against, less degenerate. Those two criteria for a good burn deck would be being able to replenish resources and requiring player interaction. And it seems like the player interaction part seems like it's a fairly tall order. There we go. But in all reality, it isn't. And the reason is because in our experience, burn tends to be a game mechanic based in spell and trap cards, which the game has relatively few generic counters for, and a lot of them are pretty bad. Things like Dark Bribe or Magic Jammer or something like this. I mean, we do have Trap Stun, and that's fairly common today, but other than that, we don't have a whole lot of counters for it. So one thing that you can do in order to make a burn deck less degenerate is shift it from being spell and trap card based to being monster card based. That instantly increases the number of mainstream counters to that deck and mainstream interactions that it can make between Fiendish Chain, Bottomless Trap Hole, Torrential, Effect Veiler, all sorts of things can begin to interact with those monster cards, as opposed to the spell cards, the spell and trap cards, which you can't really interact with unless you have like Solemn Judgment or Trap Stun or something like that. As soon as you put monsters into the game, you have the battle phase going in your favor. You have monster effect negation, which there is a ton of. You have anti-monster traps, things like that. So that immediately makes the deck less degenerate. And then you can make the monster effects require you to have some interaction with your opponent in order for them to go off. And I'll give you a couple examples in a second. But the other requirement that you have to make from there is to make the monsters, or all the card effects, be able to replenish resources. One of the problems with burn effects is that they don't give you any kind of card advantage. They don't give you any resources to work with. You burn your opponent for some damage, and then that's it. That's all you've got. You've used up that resource. So in order to make the deck competitive, along with it being interactive, is to make cards that can replenish resources. And to show you guys how easy this is, I've actually come up with some examples of cards from a potential archetype that fit both of these criteria. So I'm just going to run down, I think, 3 of them, maybe 4. So the first one would be a Summoner Monk style monster, which says that you can discard one monster from that archetype from your hand to special summon a level 4 or lower monster from your deck of that archetype to the field. That monster cannot be used for Xyz or Synchro material except for monsters of that archetype during this turn. But once you do that, after that monster is summoned, the Summoner Monk monster burns your opponent for X amount of damage times the level of the monster that you discarded. So there you have a monster that creates resources through its burn effect. It isn't absolutely broken. It requires the interaction of making itself vulnerable to Effect Veil or Fiendish Chain. The second monster would be a sizable beater whose effect is if this monster destroys an opponent's monster by battle and possibly sends it to the graveyard, depending on how good they want to make it, burn your opponent for X amount of damage times the level of the monster that this card destroyed, and then add a monster of this card's archetype or whatever from your deck to your hand except this card. So there you have a monster that special summons from the deck and does burn damage, a monster that adds from your deck to your hand and does burn damage, and both of those cards are relatively vulnerable to your opponent's effects, which means that you can have that player interaction. They're both good cards, but they both run the risk of being able to be countered by your opponent, which brings in other cards that I have been thinking of. The first one would be, it sounds fairly broken until you really think about it, based in the other two cards, which is a counter trap card whose effect is you tribute one monster of such and such archetype to negate the activation of a spell or trap card or the special summon of a monster and destroy that card. Then you draw one card, and then you deal 1,000 points of damage. So that draw a card, negate a card, and deal 1,000 points of damage sounds really spectacularly broken, but then you think about the fact that you have to tribute a monster in order to activate it, which would balance the card out, since this deck seems to would have based in the requirement that its burn effects come from monster cards, that you have to reduce your field presence, which is a disadvantage. So you do draw a card, and it ends up being a 1-for-1 plus burn damage, but you have to sacrifice the ever-important field presence in order to do it, which balances out the card. And it does, in effect, help you with the spell and trap cards that are going to give you trouble. If you use the Summoner Monk card, you can activate the Summoner Monk card's effect, and then when you summon the monster, if they torrential, you can negate it with this card, draw a card, and you get utility out of the cards that you have already used, and you get burn damage. Then maybe you have a boss monster that when one of your monsters of such and such archetypes gets destroyed, you can special summon it from your hand, and once per turn you can banish one of those monsters from your graveyard in order to deal damage to your opponent equal to X times that monster's level. So that's just a couple of cards that can give you an example of how a burn deck could be good and could require player interaction. So I have many more of these. I'm actually thinking of uploading onto my Facebook page an idea for the archetype and a few more cards that I haven't talked about in this video, so definitely check that out. I'm going to be doing that a little bit later once I've actually made these cards and thought about the deck a little better. But I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, hit that thumbs up button. If you didn't, let me know why in the comment section below. And of course, comment, what do you think of the possibility of a non-degenerate competitive burn deck? Do you think that it is possible? Would you play that deck? Doesn't sound like fun. Anyway, if you haven't already, absolutely subscribe for more deck succession, analysis, and general Yu-Gi-Oh! Shenanigans. Meanwhile, thank you guys for watching Yu-Gi-Oh! and Business Casual. I'm your host, the RJB0, and I got a jet. See you guys.